She thought she was in control. She thought she could decide who deserved respect. But in just one flight, one small mistake, she lost everything. A flight attendant denied a woman a simple cup of water, never realizing she had just disrespected the most powerful person on the plane. By the time they landed, her entire career was over. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Naomi sat comfortably in her first-class seat, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck as she reached for the in-flight menu. The plane was nearly full, and the quiet hum of passengers settling in filled the air. She wasn't in a rush. Flying had become second nature to her, just another part of her life, another city to visit, another deal to close. She had learned long ago that patience was the key to everything. Melissa walked down the aisle with quick, sharp steps, stopping at each row to check on passengers. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her posture straight, her expression carrying the kind of authority that made it clear she expected to be obeyed. When she reached the first-class section, her smile grew wider, her voice softer, almost rehearsed. She leaned in to offer champagne to a man in a crisp suit, laughing at whatever joke he made, before gracefully moving to the next seat, making sure everyone felt important. Then she stopped. Her smile faded just a little when her eyes landed on Naomi, sitting in seat 1A. There was no greeting, no warm tone in her voice, just a pause, long enough to make it clear that something was off. Instead of offering a drink, she simply nodded and moved on, acting as if she hadn't noticed Naomi sitting there at all. Naomi wasn't surprised. It had happened before. She knew the look, the subtle shift in body language, the way some people hesitated before addressing her. She could almost hear the thoughts running through Melissa's mind. Does she belong here? Did she buy this seat? She had seen it enough times to recognize it immediately. She didn't react, didn't frown or demand attention. Instead, she waited. A few minutes passed before Melissa returned, still moving with that same confident air, still treating first-class passengers like they were royalty. This time, Naomi lifted her head and spoke in a calm, polite voice. "Excuse me, may I have a cup of water?" The request was simple, nothing extravagant, nothing that required extra effort, just water. Melissa barely spared her a glance before letting out a soft sigh, the kind people use when they think they're being asked to do something unnecessary. "Water is for economy," she said, her voice clipped. "We serve champagne or juice in first class." Naomi blinked, her expression unreadable. "I just want water." Melissa didn't hide her irritation. She shifted her weight, crossed her arms, and shook her head. "You're in first class, ma'am. We don't serve plain water here unless it's bottled, and that's reserved for priority guests." She glanced down at her notepad and scribbled something before looking up again. "Would you like a different drink?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression still calm, still composed. "So you're saying I can't have a cup of water?" Melissa shrugged. "I'm saying we have a menu. First-class service is reserved for our premium passengers." For the first time, Naomi smiled. Not a warm smile, not amused, just a small, knowing curve of her lips. "And I don't qualify as a premium passenger?" Melissa hesitated, as if realizing she had said too much. A few passengers nearby had started paying attention, pretending not to listen, while their eyes flickered between the two women. There was a brief moment where Melissa could have corrected herself, could have walked away, could have simply said, "My mistake," but instead she doubled down. "If you can afford this seat," she said, her voice quieter now, "I'm sure you can afford to buy a bottle of water when we land." A small hush spread through the front cabin. Naomi didn't react, didn't argue. She simply pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and set it down on the armrest. Then she waited. Melissa turned away, her posture stiff, as if she had just put an end to the conversation. She continued down the aisle, offering drinks to other first-class passengers, her voice light and cheerful, as if the exchange with Naomi hadn't just happened. Naomi remained in her seat, her face calm, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. She had dealt with people like Melissa before, people who assumed power based on nothing but a uniform and a title. She had learned long ago that true power didn't need to be shown. It simply existed. A younger flight attendant named Claire had been watching the exchange from the galley. She had been working under Melissa for the past year and had seen how she operated. Melissa treated first-class passengers like VIPs, but only the ones she deemed worthy. Claire knew Naomi had asked for something as simple as water, yet Melissa had made it a point to deny her. Claire hesitated for a moment, glancing at the bottle of chilled water sitting in the galley storage area. With a quiet breath, she picked it up and walked over to Naomi's seat. "Here you go, ma'am," Claire said softly, setting the bottle on Naomi's tray table. "Let me know if you need anything else." Naomi glanced at Claire, her expression unreadable. There was no need for words, no need for a dramatic response. She simply nodded. Claire smiled politely before walking away, but Melissa saw. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Claire handing the bottle to Naomi, and a flash of irritation crossed her face. With a sharp turn, she stormed back toward Claire, her heels clicking against the floor as she stopped just outside the galley. "What do you think you're doing?" Melissa hissed under her breath. Claire's face stiffened. "She asked for water." Melissa narrowed her eyes. "And I already told her we don't serve it." "It's just water," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Melissa leaned in, lowering her voice. "We have rules, Claire. You don't get to decide who gets what." Claire hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She had worked hard to get this job, had followed every protocol, but there was something deeply uncomfortable about what Melissa was saying. "It's not about the rules, is it?" Claire asked, her voice quiet but firm. "You just didn't want her to have it." Melissa's jaw tightened. "Stay in your place, Claire." Claire held her ground, but she knew there was no use arguing with Melissa. She gave a small nod, stepping back, but the damage had already been done. Melissa turned sharply, walking past Naomi's seat without another glance. Naomi picked up the bottle, twisting the cap open with ease. She took a small sip, placing the bottle back down as if the whole thing had never happened. But something had changed. Melissa didn't know it yet, but the moment she chose to make this a fight, she had already lost. Naomi had sent a message earlier, and she was waiting for the reply. Melissa returned to her duties, but she couldn't shake the irritation bubbling inside her. She prided herself on maintaining control in the first-class cabin. Everything had to run smoothly, efficiently, and, most importantly, according to her own standards. Yet Claire had openly defied her, and worse, the woman in 1A had sat there, silent but unshaken, as if none of it mattered. She stole a glance at Naomi, expecting her to look smug or triumphant. But Naomi wasn't paying her any attention. She was calmly scrolling through her phone, completely at ease, as if Melissa didn't exist. That only made it worse. Melissa squared her shoulders and made a decision. If Naomi thought she could undermine her authority, she had another thing coming. A few minutes later, as the flight attendants began preparing for meal service, Melissa made sure she was the one handling Naomi's row. She moved efficiently, taking orders from the other first-class passengers, giving them polite smiles and nods, her voice dripping with charm. But when she reached 1A, her demeanor shifted. "We're serving lobster risotto and filet mignon for first class today," Melissa said, her tone neutral, though her eyes were cold. "But I assume you'd prefer something simpler." Naomi lifted her gaze, meeting Melissa's stare head-on. "And why would you assume that?" Melissa's lips pressed into a thin smile. "You just seem more comfortable with basic options." The air around them grew thick with tension. A few passengers subtly turned their heads, sensing the shift. Claire, standing a few feet away, froze mid-step, watching with growing unease. Naomi, however, didn't react. She simply set her phone down on the armrest, her fingers tapping lightly. "The filet mignon is fine," she said, her voice calm. Melissa nodded sharply and scribbled it down on her notepad. But before she could step away, Naomi spoke again. "Tell me," Naomi said, tilting her head slightly, "do you treat all your first-class passengers this way? Or just the ones you assume don't belong?" Melissa stiffened. The question caught her off guard, and for a split second, she didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth and shut it again, her grip tightening on the notepad. "I treat all passengers according to airline policy," she said finally, forcing a polite tone. Naomi smiled, but it wasn't friendly, it was knowing. "Good to know," she said softly, picking up her phone once more. Melissa turned on her heel and walked away, her chest tight with frustration. But as she stepped back into the galley, her stomach twisted. Because this time, she had seen it. Right before Naomi picked up her phone again, a message had flashed across the screen. A reply to the one she had sent earlier. And the name attached to the response? It was a name Melissa recognized. It was the CEO of the airline. Melissa's pulse quickened as she moved back into the galley. She could still see the name on Naomi's phone screen flashing in her mind like a warning sign. The CEO, her boss's boss. The man whose signature controlled every paycheck on this airline, including hers. For the first time since the flight began, uncertainty crept into her chest. She tried to shake it off. Maybe she had misread it. Maybe it wasn't what she thought. But deep down, she knew. Something was wrong. Taking a deep breath, she pulled herself together. No, this was nothing. Just a passenger trying to act important. She had dealt with entitled travelers before, people who wanted to make a scene just to get special treatment. Naomi had probably contacted customer service, and they would send the usual, "We apologize for the inconvenience" response. Nothing would come of it. But despite her internal reassurance, Melissa's hands were slightly unsteady as she reached for a glass, pouring champagne for another passenger. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. A few minutes later, as she passed through the aisle, she noticed Naomi was no longer looking at her phone. She sat still, relaxed, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest as if she had all the time in the world. That same unreadable expression on her face. Melissa didn't like it. She glanced at the other passengers, subtly checking if anyone else had noticed the tension. But most people were occupied with their meals, conversations, or movies. Only Claire, standing near the galley, met her gaze, and the look in Claire's eyes said everything. She knew. Melissa's throat tightened. She had to take back control. She turned away sharply, gripping the edge of the galley counter. Maybe it was time to put Naomi in her place once and for all. She pulled up the passenger list on the in-flight tablet. The names, seat numbers, and loyalty status of every first-class passenger were there. Her eyes moved quickly down the list, searching for Naomi's full name. And then she saw it. Naomi Carter. The moment she read it, her breath caught in her throat. Her stomach dropped. The name wasn't just familiar, it was impossible to ignore. Melissa knew that name. Everyone in the airline industry knew that name. Because Naomi Carter wasn't just any first-class passenger. She was the owner of the airline. Melissa's fingers tightened around the tablet as she stared at the name on the screen. Naomi Carter. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just a wealthy traveler who happened to share a name with someone important. It was her. The woman she had refused water. The woman she had belittled. The woman she had treated like she didn't belong. The billionaire who owned the very airline she worked for. Her breath hitched. A cold sweat formed at the back of her neck. The realization settled in like a slow-moving disaster, each second making it worse. She felt the weight of the moment crash over her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just an unpleasant passenger who might file a complaint. This was the worst possible person she could have mistreated. Her mind scrambled for a way out. Damage control. Maybe Naomi hadn't sent the message to the CEO. Maybe she hadn't noticed Melissa's name. Maybe there was still time to fix this. Melissa inhaled sharply, forcing a composed expression as she turned back toward the aisle. She couldn't let anyone see that she was rattled. She had to be smart, careful. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor, stopping beside Naomi's seat. With a deep breath, she put on her most professional smile, the same one she used for VIP passengers. "Mrs. Carter," Melissa said, her voice now dripping with politeness. "I wanted to personally apologize if there was any miscommunication earlier. I'd be happy to bring you that water now." Naomi didn't look up right away. She took her time, turning her head slowly to face Melissa, her expression unreadable. Melissa felt her pulse hammering against her ribs, but she kept the smile in place. Naomi let out a soft, almost amused exhale. Then, with a quiet calmness that made the moment even more unbearable, she said, "No, thank you." Melissa blinked. Of course, but if there's anything else I can..." Naomi cut her off, still perfectly composed. I think we're past that. A hush spread through the surrounding seats. Claire, standing near the galley, had frozen in place. Even passengers who had been distracted before were now paying attention, sensing the sudden shift in power. Melissa's stomach twisted into a tight knot. Naomi knew. She knew everything. Melissa opened her mouth again, desperate to regain control. But before she could speak, Naomi picked up her phone from the armrest, glancing at the screen. Then in one effortless motion, she tapped a single button and set it back down. Melissa's heart nearly stopped, because she knew, without a doubt, that single tap had just sealed her fate. Melissa felt her entire body go rigid. She had spent years working her way up in the airline, enforcing rules, demanding respect, making sure every passenger knew who was in charge. But now, standing next to Naomi Carter's seat, she had never felt smaller in her life. Her mind raced. That tap on the phone. What did it mean? Was it a message? A call? Was Naomi already speaking to someone higher up? Was this just the beginning of something worse? She swallowed, struggling to keep her face neutral. Mrs. Carter, she started again, her voice softer, more careful now. I truly didn't mean any offense earlier. It was just a misunderstanding. Naomi's eyes flickered up to her, unimpressed. Was it? Melissa forced a laugh, trying to lighten the tension, though it sounded weak even to her own ears. Of course, you know how these flights can get, especially when we're managing different requests from passengers. It wasn't personal. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Not personal, she echoed, her voice still calm, still controlled. She let the silence stretch just long enough for Melissa's confidence to waver. Melissa felt a pit form in her stomach. I only meant that. Let me ask you something, Naomi interrupted smoothly, still leaning back in her seat, still perfectly composed. How long have you been working as a flight attendant? Melissa hesitated, thrown off by the sudden shift in conversation. Almost 10 years, she answered quickly, trying to figure out where this was going. Naomi nodded slowly. 10 years, that's a long time. You must have served thousands of passengers. Yes, ma'am, Melissa said, feeling hopeful for the first time. Maybe Naomi was softening. Maybe she was giving her a chance to explain herself. I always do my best to provide excellent service. Naomi studied her for a moment, then asked, and in those 10 years, how many first-class passengers have you denied a cup of water? The question hit like a punch to the stomach. Melissa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The weight of the moment pressed against her, and she suddenly realized there was no right answer. If she admitted she had never done it before, then she was caught. If she said she had done it to others, she only made herself look worse. Naomi waited unbothered, completely in control. Melissa forced another shaky laugh. I was just following standard beverage service. Don't lie, Naomi said simply. The words weren't loud. They weren't harsh. But they shut Melissa up instantly. A few seats away, a businessman who had been pretending to read his magazine slowly lowered it, his eyes now fully on the conversation. Others shifted slightly in their seats, trying not to be obvious as they listened. Melissa felt her hands getting clammy. Her head was spinning, trying to find a way out, but Naomi wasn't finished. You knew I belonged in this seat, Naomi continued. You saw my boarding pass. You knew I was in first class. Yet you looked at me and decided I wasn't worthy of a cup of water. She let that sink in before adding, tell me, was that in the training manual? Melissa's entire body tensed. No, ma'am, she whispered, her confidence all but gone. Naomi gave a small nod. That's what I thought. The air in first class felt heavier now, thick with the kind of silence that meant something was about to happen. The tension had shifted entirely. Melissa had walked into this interaction thinking she had all the power, and now she was standing there completely exposed. Then Naomi did something Melissa wasn't expecting. She picked up her phone again, and this time, she didn't just tap the screen. She held it to her ear and spoke. Tell the captain I'd like to have a word. Melissa's stomach dropped. She barely registered the shocked expressions on the passengers around her, barely noticed Claire's wide eyes from across the cabin. All she could focus on was the rising panic inside her. The captain. Melissa's mouth went dry. If the captain was getting involved, this wasn't just a complaint anymore. This was serious. She stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding. Mrs. Carter, Naomi set the phone back down, her expression never changing. You should get back to work, Melissa. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a dismissal. And for the first time in her entire career, Melissa had no choice but to listen. Melissa walked away on unsteady legs, her mind racing with possibilities. Tell the captain I'd like to have a word. The sentence replayed in her head over and over, each repetition tightening the panic coiling in her chest. She had never, not once, been called to the front of a flight because of a passenger complaint. Usually she was the one reporting unruly customers, enforcing policies, keeping things in order. But this was different. Naomi Carter wasn't just another passenger. Naomi Carter could end her career with a single sentence. As she reached the galley, she grabbed the counter with both hands, her knuckles whitening. Claire was still standing nearby, watching her carefully, but she didn't say anything right away. Melissa turned to her sharply. You saw what just happened, right? Claire hesitated. I saw you deny a first-class passenger a cup of water. Melissa's mouth pressed into a tight line. I wasn't denying her anything. I was just... She cut herself off, realizing she had no real explanation. Claire folded her arms. Melissa, do you even know who she is? Melissa swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She knew now. She knew the moment she saw Naomi's name on the passenger list. But admitting that to Claire would only make things worse. Claire sighed. Look, I don't know what's about to happen, but if I were you, I'd start thinking about what you're going to say to the captain. Melissa flinched. The captain? The thought made her stomach churn. Just as she was about to respond, the intercom clicked on, and the pilot's voice filled the cabin. Melissa Crane, report to the cockpit immediately. Everything stopped. Melissa's breath caught in her throat. The galley, the first-class cabin, even the distant murmuring from economy. Everything else faded except for those words. Claire's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The damage was already done. Melissa took a slow step forward, feeling the weight of every passenger's gaze on her. The businessman who had been eavesdropping earlier now openly stared. A woman across the aisle whispered something to her seatmate, both of them glancing at Melissa as she passed. Even the passengers who had ignored the earlier tension were watching now. She walked through the first-class cabin with her head high, but inside she was suffocating. The walk to the cockpit felt like a lifetime. She reached the door, pressed the call button, and after a few seconds it unlocked with a small beep. Pushing it open, she stepped inside and immediately felt the atmosphere shift. Captain Richard Hayes sat in his seat, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. His co-pilot, a younger man named Ethan, glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the controls. But the real problem wasn't them. Melissa's throat tightened when she saw the flight supervisor, Greg Turner, standing in the small space between the cockpit seats. He was never on these flights. He only got involved when there was a serious issue. Greg was already looking at her, his expression cold. Sit down, Melissa. She hesitated for a second before lowering herself into the small jump seat by the cockpit door. She had been in this seat before, but never like this. Never as the one being questioned. Captain Hayes exhaled through his nose, then turned his chair slightly to face her. Would you like to explain why I just received a call from Naomi Carter? Melissa's hands clenched in her lap. Captain, Greg held up a hand, cutting her off. Before you try to spin this, let me remind you that I already know everything. His gaze hardened. So choose your words carefully. Melissa's mouth went dry. Silence stretched in the cockpit, thick and heavy. The only sound was the low hum of the aircraft, the quiet clicking of buttons as Ethan adjusted the flight settings. Melissa tried to steady her breathing. There had to be a way out of this. I didn't know who she was, she finally said, her voice quiet. Greg's jaw tightened. That doesn't make this better. Melissa shook her head quickly. I was just following the service guidelines. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. Greg let out a slow, measured breath. Tell me exactly what happened. Melissa hesitated, glancing at Captain Hayes, but his expression gave nothing away. He was waiting. She swallowed. She asked for water. I told her that first-class beverages are limited to what's on the menu. She asked for water, Greg repeated, his voice sharp. Not wine, not an expensive cocktail. Water. Melissa flinched. Greg folded his arms. And let me guess, you had no problem serving the other first-class passengers? Melissa's pulse pounded in her ears. I didn't think... That much is clear, Greg interrupted. Captain Hayes finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Melissa, do you understand what's happening right now? His tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. Melissa stayed silent. Greg sighed. We're 30,000 feet in the air, so I can't remove you from the flight right now, he said. But the moment we land, you are to report directly to Airline Administration. Melissa felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers dug into her lap. Wait, this isn't a warning, Greg continued. This isn't a suspension. It's already been decided. Melissa's breathing grew shallow. Decided? Captain Hayes met her eyes. Naomi Carter owns this airline, he said, and she just made it clear that you no longer work here. Melissa's stomach dropped. The cockpit suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. The reality of what was happening slammed into her all at once. She had spent years controlling this cabin. Now she was the one being removed from it. Melissa sat frozen in the jump seat, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. No longer work here. The words rang in her ears, louder than the steady hum of the engines, louder than the soft crackle of the radio in the background. She had always believed she was untouchable. Seniority, experience, control over the cabin. She had built her entire career on those things. But now none of it mattered. Greg was still watching her, his expression unreadable. Captain Hayes had turned back toward the flight controls as if the conversation was already over. Melissa swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. This isn't fair. Greg arched an eyebrow. Not fair? He leaned forward slightly. You denied a first-class passenger the most basic request on a flight, a glass of water. Then you spoke down to her like she didn't belong, and now you're telling me it's not fair? Melissa's hands clenched into fists. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean... You didn't mean what? Greg's voice was sharp now. You didn't mean to treat a woman who owns this airline like a second-class citizen? You didn't mean to humiliate her in front of the entire first-class cabin? Melissa felt heat rising in her face. I didn't know who she was, she blurted out. Greg let out a slow, bitter chuckle. That's the problem, isn't it? He shook his head. You shouldn't need to know someone's net worth to treat them with respect. Melissa had no response to that. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Greg exhaled through his nose, shaking his head again, before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small notepad and a pen, scribbling something down before tearing off the page. Then, without a word, he handed it to Melissa. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling slightly. Crew jump seat, back of the plane. She stared at the words, her stomach twisting. Greg folded his arms. You're done serving passengers. You'll spend the rest of this flight in the crew section, away from first class. When we land, you'll be escorted directly off the plane. No crew debriefing. No last-minute explanations. His eyes hardened. Naomi Carter doesn't want to see you anywhere near her. Melissa felt her chest tighten. This was real. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could get a single word out, Captain Hayes spoke again. If you refuse to move, we have an air marshal on board, he said simply, not even looking at her. I'd suggest you take the seat voluntarily. Melissa's entire body went cold. She had always been the one giving orders. Now she was the one being ordered. With no other choice, she pushed herself up from the jump seat. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she stepped toward the cockpit door. She could feel Greg's eyes on her, but he didn't say another word. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, she felt it. The weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her. Passengers had heard the intercom call. They had seen the tense conversation earlier. And now they were watching her walk back down the aisle like someone on a walk of shame. She didn't meet their eyes. Her face burned as she moved past row after row, past businessmen sipping their expensive cocktails, past women who had been quietly whispering, past the very passengers she had once believed were beneath her notice. and then she passed seat 1A. Naomi Carter didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She sat exactly as she had before, calm, composed, her fingers lightly resting on her phone. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction, just certainty. She had seen it all before. She had probably dealt with countless Melissa Cranes in her lifetime. And now she had done what she always did. She had handled it without ever raising her voice. Melissa's hands trembled as she walked past her, past the first-class section she had ruled over for years, past the luxury and privilege she had once taken for granted. The moment she stepped through the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, the reality of her downfall crashed over her. She wasn't a respected senior flight attendant anymore. She wasn't in control of anything. She was just another disgraced crew member, sitting in the back, waiting for the flight to end. Melissa sank into the crew jump seat at the back of the plane, her uniform suddenly feeling suffocating. The once crisp fabric now felt tight around her throat, like it was strangling her. She barely noticed the other flight attendants moving past her, setting up final service preparations for the passengers. No one spoke to her. No one even looked at her. Her fingers curled into fists in her lap. This couldn't be happening. For 10 years, she had been the one in charge, the one enforcing the rules, the one deciding which passengers got the extra perks, who got the warmest greeting, and who got the bare minimum. She had worked her way up through long flights, difficult passengers, and endless hours of managing demanding travelers. And now all of that was gone, not because of some huge mistake, not because she endangered a flight, because of water. Melissa let out a slow, shaky breath, staring straight ahead at the galley wall in front of her. The humiliation of walking through the first-class cabin still burned in her chest. She had felt the whispers. The passengers hadn't even tried to hide it, some whispering behind their hands, others outright watching as she passed. She clenched her teeth. This wasn't just a punishment. This was a public execution. Her hands reached for her phone, desperate to find a lifeline. Someone had to be able to fix this. Maybe a union representative. Maybe someone in HR. Maybe even a lawyer. But when she unlocked the screen, her blood ran cold. There was already a notification at the top of her phone. Your employee access has been restricted. Her stomach dropped. Her access to the airline's internal system was already being revoked. She fumbled to open the crew app, the same one she had used for years to check her upcoming flight schedules, communicate with supervisors, and report any passenger incidents. But the moment she tapped the icon, the screen flashed red. Error, invalid login. Melissa's breathing grew uneven. She tried again, her fingers shaking now. Error, account not found. Her mouth went dry. They weren't just preparing to fire her. She was already gone. They had locked her out of the system before she even stepped off the plane. Her heart pounded in her ears. She switched to her messages, scrolling frantically through her contacts, looking for someone, anyone who might be able to tell her what was happening. She tapped the name of her closest contact in crew management. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then it went straight to voicemail. She tried another name. Voicemail again. Her stomach twisted into knots. Had the news already spread? Was she being completely shut out? A sudden ding pulled her attention back to the screen. A new message. Her breath hitched, but when she opened it, her heart sank. It wasn't from crew management. It wasn't from HR. It was from a former colleague. Someone she had worked with years ago. Someone who had left the airline after being pushed out in a similar way. The message was only 3 words. You're done, Melissa. Her pulse pounded. Her hands went limp, the phone slipping slightly from her grasp. This wasn't just a termination. This was an erasure. The airline wasn't just firing her. They were making sure she could never work in the industry again. And the worst part? She knew exactly who was behind it. Naomi Carter hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She hadn't demanded a scene. She had sent a single message. And now Melissa's entire career was gone before the plane had even landed. She pressed a shaky hand to her forehead, nausea rising in her stomach. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, everything she had taken pride in, it was all slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Melissa's mind spiraled as she sat in the cramped crew jump seat, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had to fix this. There had to be a way out. Her fingers flew across the screen, typing a message to another senior crew member she had worked with for years. Someone she trusted. Someone who had always respected her experience. Melissa. "Hey, I need to talk. Something's happening. Call me as soon as you can." She stared at the message for a second before pressing send. The moment it went through, she started another one, this time to a manager at the airline's corporate office, someone she had met at a training seminar last year. "Melissa, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Can you check what's going on with my access? I'm locked out of the system." She sent that one too. Then another, and another. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming faster. Someone had to respond. Someone had to tell her that this wasn't real, that there was still a way to fix it. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. No replies, no callbacks, no reassuring messages telling her it was all a mistake. Just silence. Melissa's throat tightened. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep breathing evenly. This wasn't over. She wouldn't let it be over. A sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Melissa looked up just in time to see another flight attendant standing in front of her, one of the junior crew members from the economy section. "What?" Melissa snapped, her nerves already on edge. The flight attendant hesitated for a second before shifting awkwardly. We need the space back here for meal service. Captain said you need to stay seated and out of the way." Melissa's jaw clenched. They were treating her like she was nothing, like she was a problem that needed to be contained. But she didn't argue. She just nodded stiffly and turned her gaze toward the back wall, pretending not to hear the clatter of trays being set up just a few feet away. The other flight attendants whispered to each other as they worked, but Melissa didn't have to strain to know what they were saying. They knew. They all knew. Every now and then, one of them would glance at her, their expressions unreadable, some filled with quiet satisfaction, others with thinly veiled pity. And that was the worst part. She didn't want their pity. She had spent years walking through the first-class cabin with her head high, making sure everyone respected her authority. She had built a reputation for being sharp, precise, and always in control. But now, she was sitting at the back of the plane, completely powerless. Melissa stared down at her phone, willing it to light up with a response. Any response. But nothing came. Instead, a different sound filled the air, the soft chime of the cabin intercom. "This is your captain speaking." Hayes's voice rang out, steady and professional. "We'll be starting our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." Melissa barely heard the rest. Her mind was locked on a single thought. Landing. She was running out of time. The moment the wheels touched the ground, she would be escorted off the plane. She wouldn't have the chance to walk off like a normal crew member. She would be removed. And then what? Would security be waiting for her? Would she be handed a termination letter right there in the terminal? Would she even be allowed to speak to someone before they erased her from the airline completely? Her breathing grew shallow, panic clawing at her ribs. She had to do something. Now her eyes darted toward the first-class section. Naomi Carter was still there. If anyone had the power to stop this, to fix this, it was her. Melissa didn't hesitate. She pushed herself up from the seat, her legs weak but determined. She ignored the glances from the other flight attendants as she marched toward the front of the plane. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to beg. Melissa forced herself to move forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The plane's slight turbulence barely registered as she walked past the rows of passengers, heading straight for first class. She had spent years owning this aisle, years walking up and down with authority, making decisions, controlling the flow of service, making sure everyone knew who was in charge. Now she felt like an outsider in her own cabin. As she stepped past the partition, separating economy from first class, a few passengers lifted their heads, their eyes flickering between her and seat 1A. Naomi Carter sat comfortably in her seat, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on her phone. She wasn't watching a movie. She wasn't engaged in conversation. She was simply waiting. Melissa's stomach twisted. Naomi knew she was coming. She hesitated for half a second, but forced herself to keep going. Stopping now would only make things worse. As she reached Naomi's seat, she took a shallow breath, pressing her sweaty hands against her uniform skirt to steady herself. She needed to fix this. Clearing her throat, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Carter, may I have a moment?" Naomi didn't look up right away. She took her time, exhaling softly before finally lifting her gaze. Her expression didn't change. No anger, no satisfaction, no irritation. Just calm, unwavering control. Melissa swallowed. I just wanted to apologize," she said quickly, forcing her voice to remain steady. "For earlier, I made a mistake." Naomi blinked slowly, as if giving her a chance to keep going. Melissa hesitated, her pride screaming at her to stop. But this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. She forced herself to continue. "I should have handled the situation differently. I should have given you what you asked for." She licked her dry lips, her voice growing softer. "It wasn't my place to question you." Naomi didn't react. Melissa's heart pounded. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. A few rows away, Claire stood near the galley, her arms crossed tightly. The younger flight attendant wasn't saying anything, but the look on her face made it clear she was watching every second of this. Melissa hated that. She had spent years training people like Claire, making sure they respected the rules, making sure they understood how things worked in the airline industry. Now Claire was watching her beg for mercy. Melissa turned her attention back to Naomi, gripping the seat in front of her as she leaned in slightly. "I know I offended you," she continued, her voice dropping lower. I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go this far." Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying her. "And what exactly does this far mean?" Melissa flinched. She hadn't expected a response. She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I know you contacted the captain. I know what's happening when we land." Naomi nodded slightly, as if confirming it, without actually saying it. Melissa's pulse spiked. She had to fix this now. Her voice dropped even lower, filled with desperation. "Please," she whispered. "I've worked for this airline for 10 years. I made one mistake. I don't deserve to have my entire career destroyed over this." Naomi didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move. Melissa felt herself unraveling. She couldn't read Naomi at all. Was she considering the apology? Was she ignoring her? Had she already made up her mind? Melissa leaned in even further, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "If you can just speak to the captain," she said quickly, maybe he can reconsider. Maybe we can fix this before we land, before things become permanent." For the first time, Naomi's lips curved into the slightest smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't cruel either. It was just knowing. Melissa's throat tightened. Naomi inhaled softly, glancing down at her phone again. For a brief moment, Melissa thought she was about to pick it up, about to send a message that would stop all of this before it was too late. Then Naomi met her eyes again and said, "Why should I?" Melissa's stomach dropped. I just told you. This is my career, my life," she said, her voice now openly desperate. "I know I messed up. I know I shouldn't have treated you like that, but I'm willing to make it right." Naomi's expression didn't change. "Make it right?" she repeated. "Tell me, Melissa, if I wasn't who I am, would you be trying to make it right now?" Melissa froze. A fresh wave of nausea hit her, because the answer was no. If Naomi Carter had been anyone else, just another businesswoman, just another well-dressed first-class passenger, Melissa would have doubled down. She would have refused to apologize. She would have stood by her decision. She would have defended herself, maybe even turned it around and blamed Naomi for being difficult. She knew that, and Naomi knew that. Melissa tried to find the words, but her mouth had gone completely dry. Naomi gave her a long, slow look before picking up her phone and typing something. Melissa's breath caught in her throat. Was she reversing the decision? Was she telling the captain to hold off? Then Naomi set the phone down again and leaned back slightly, completely at ease. "I don't think you've learned anything," she said calmly. Melissa felt her stomach sink into the floor. Naomi exhaled softly, shaking her head. This isn't about your career. This is about the way you see people. And I don't think that's going to change just because you're afraid of losing your job. Melissa felt like she had been slapped. She opened her mouth again, ready to beg. Actually beg. But Naomi had already turned away. The conversation was over. The flight attendants in the galley had heard every word. A few passengers nearby had too. Melissa's face burned as she turned sharply, walking back toward the rear of the plane. Her entire body trembled. She had done everything she could. She had swallowed her pride, apologized, practically pleaded. But none of it mattered, because Naomi Carter had already decided, and her decision was final. Melissa barely made it back to the crew jump seat before her legs gave out. She sat down hard, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. The walls of the plane suddenly felt smaller, closing in on her, pressing against her chest. This couldn't be real. She had begged. She had put aside her pride, her authority, her years of experience. She had admitted she was wrong. And yet, Naomi Carter hadn't even considered giving her a second chance. The realization settled in, heavier than anything she had ever felt before. Naomi Carter wasn't going to stop this. She was going to let it happen. Melissa dug her nails into her palms, her head spinning. She had spent a decade climbing the ranks, proving herself, controlling the first-class cabin like it was her personal kingdom. And now, she wasn't just losing her job. She was being erased. She stared down at her phone, her screen still blank. No messages, no callbacks, no reassurances that someone was going to help her. Her hands trembled as she checked her employee account again, still locked out. She tried to log into the airline's scheduling app. Maybe she could see if her future flights had been canceled. Error, account not found. Melissa squeezed her eyes shut, nausea crawling up her throat. They weren't just firing her. They were making sure she never worked in the airline industry again. She knew how this worked. She had seen it happen to others, flight attendants who had been let go quietly, their records marked in a way that made them unemployable. And now it was happening to her. Her breath hitched. Her entire life was about to change. The intercom chimed overhead, and Captain Hayes' voice rang through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. And flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Melissa's body stiffened. This was it. She turned, glancing toward the first-class section one last time. Naomi Carter hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, perfectly composed, watching the view outside the window, as if none of this mattered. And maybe to her it didn't. Maybe Melissa had never mattered. A lump formed in her throat. She looked away quickly, her eyes burning, her chest tightening with a new kind of panic. The kind that came when you realized there was nothing left to do. The plane jolted slightly as the landing gear deployed. Passengers murmured, fastening their seatbelts, shifting in their seats. Some stretched their arms, gathering their belongings, preparing to leave the plane as if this were just another ordinary flight. For them, it was. For Melissa, it was the last flight of her career. She swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the jump seat. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, the familiar feeling of the descent pressing against her body. She had done this flight thousands of times. The final descent, the taxi to the gate, the deplaning process, it had always been routine. But now for the first time, she didn't know what was waiting for her on the other side of that jet bridge. Would she be escorted off the plane like a criminal? Would the airline's executives be standing there, waiting for her, already prepared to strip her of her badge, her uniform, her title? Would security be involved? Would passengers be watching, filming? Her breath quickened. She wasn't ready, but the plane didn't care. The tires touched down with a sharp jolt, the engines roaring as the aircraft slowed on the runway. A few passengers clapped lightly, a habit, a meaningless routine. Melissa barely heard it. Her entire body was frozen. The plane taxied toward the gate, and with every passing second, the weight in her chest grew heavier. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to wake up and realize this was all just some horrible nightmare. But then, with a final ding, the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers unbuckled, people stood up, stretching, reaching for their bags. Flight attendants in first class moved swiftly, preparing to open the cabin doors. Melissa stayed seated, frozen. The curtain between first class and economy was pulled open, and she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Then a familiar voice, firm, commanding, final. "Melissa Crane," Captain Hayes said, standing just in front of her. "It's time to go." Her breath hitched. She turned her head slightly, her stomach dropping even further, when she saw who was waiting at the front of the plane. Two executives from the airline, a security officer, and standing at the center of them, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression, Naomi Carter. The moment the passengers were off the plane, Melissa would be escorted out. There was no escape, no more chances. Her fate was already sealed. Melissa's entire body felt like lead as she sat in the crew jump seat, staring straight ahead. This was it, the moment she had dreaded since Naomi Carter had picked up her phone mid-flight. She had been warned. She had been given chances to correct herself before it spiraled, but she hadn't taken them. Instead, she had doubled down, convinced that her authority meant something, that she couldn't be touched. Now she was sitting at the back of the plane, powerless, while the owner of the airline stood at the front, waiting to watch her be removed. She forced herself to breathe, gripping the edges of her uniform as if holding on to it could somehow keep her job from slipping away. The murmurs of passengers filling the cabin barely registered in her ears. The seatbelt sign had barely switched off before they all began gathering their things, shuffling into the aisles, eager to get off the plane and move on with their lives. Their lives would continue. Hers had just ended. The security officer near the exit hadn't moved yet, but he didn't need to. She knew his presence was for her. She wasn't being given the option to walk off this flight with dignity. She was being escorted, just like any other passenger who had broken the rules. The irony stung. She had spent years enforcing policies, escorting passengers off planes, filing complaints when someone was too difficult to handle. Now she was one of them. The aisle was slow-moving, passengers inching forward as they reached for bags, adjusting coats, stretching after the long flight. Some still hadn't realized what was happening, but others were fully aware. A businessman from first class glanced back over his shoulder, eyes flickering toward her for only a second before looking away, shaking his head. A woman in a tailored blazer whispered something to her seatmate, subtly angling her phone away as if to hide that she was recording. Melissa's breath came faster. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stand up, walk past all these people, knowing every step she took was another reminder that she had fallen. But the moment she shifted in her seat, Captain Hayes spoke again. "Now, Melissa?" It wasn't a request, it was an order. Her stomach twisted violently, but she pushed herself up anyway, her knees feeling weak beneath her. Claire stood in the galley, her lips pressed together, eyes downcast. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't enjoying this, but she also wasn't stepping in to help. Melissa wasn't sure which was worse. She swallowed, lifting her chin, trying to mask the fear with pride. But as she took the first step down the aisle, she felt it, the weight of dozens of eyes following her. Passengers shifted slightly to the side, making space, not out of respect, but because they knew what was happening. They had seen this before, but never with a flight attendant. A first-class man who had been quiet the whole flight muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "Guess we know who wasn't supposed to be here after all." Her chest burned. She kept moving, her pulse hammering in her ears. Each step felt like a mile. The walls of the plane felt too small, the space too suffocating. Then she reached first class. She had to pass Naomi. Her breath hitched. Naomi Carter sat exactly where she had been the whole flight, perfectly composed. Her expression was neutral, not triumphant, not smug, just unbothered. She had already moved on. Melissa forced herself to keep walking, refusing to look at her. But as she passed, Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, controlled, deadly. "Do you still think I don't belong here?" Melissa's breath stopped. Her steps faltered, but she forced herself to keep moving. She couldn't answer that. Not now. She had lost the right to answer that. She reached the jet bridge and felt the sudden rush of cool airport air hit her skin as she stepped into the enclosed walkway. For a moment, she thought she could breathe again. Then she saw them. A group of airline executives stood near the terminal gate, dressed in sharp suits, waiting for her like a board of executioners. A single table had been set up near the entrance, a place for her to turn in her badge, her uniform, her access. And in front of them, standing with his arms crossed, was Greg Turner, the flight supervisor. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't pleased with what had happened, but he was here to finish it. A security officer followed behind her, making sure she didn't turn back. Melissa's throat tightened as she stepped toward the table, her legs moving on autopilot. She wanted to scream. She wanted to argue. She wanted to turn back time, undo this moment, make a different choice. But it was too late. Her career had already crashed, and she was the one who had sent it into freefall. Melissa walked toward the table, set up at the gate, her feet feeling like they were made of concrete. Each step echoed in her mind like a countdown to something final, something irreversible. The airport terminal felt like a different world compared to the plane. The warm, dim lighting of the cabin was replaced by the bright, sterile glow of overhead airport fluorescence. Everything was too open, too exposed. There was nowhere to hide. The group of airline executives standing by the table weren't speaking, but they didn't need to. Their presence alone sent a clear message. This wasn't a discussion. This was a termination. Greg Turner stood in the center, his hands resting on the table. His expression was unreadable, his mouth set in a firm professional line. He had seen many terminations in his career, but Melissa knew this wasn't just any firing. This was an example, a warning to every single crew member in the airline. Mess up badly enough, disrespect the wrong person, and you wouldn't just lose your job, you'd lose your entire career. Her throat was dry. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she'd barely noticed the low murmur of airport noise beyond the gate. Passengers from the flight had already started making their way through the terminal, glancing over as they passed. Some of them knew exactly what was happening. Others just saw a humiliated flight attendant standing at a table with a line of executives watching her like a disciplinary panel. Either way, she was being seen. She stopped in front of the table, her hands clenched so tightly into fists that her nails dug into her palms. Greg sighed, lifting a single sheet of paper from the table. "Melissa Crane," he said, his voice even, professional, detached. "Effective immediately, your employment with this airline is terminated." The words hit like a slap to the face. She already knew it was happening. She had known since the moment Naomi Carter had turned her down in first class, since Captain Hayes had called her to the cockpit, since she had been escorted off the plane like a disgraced passenger. But hearing it out loud, hearing it made it real. She forced herself to swallow, but her throat felt raw. Greg pushed the paper forward. "This is your official termination notice. It includes documentation of the incident and details regarding the formal complaints filed." Melissa's stomach twisted. Complaints, plural. That meant Naomi hadn't been the only one. Passengers had complained. Maybe even Claire had reported what happened. She was cornered. She reached out with stiff fingers, taking the paper even though she couldn't bring herself to look at it. Greg lifted a second item from the table, a small black company badge, her employee ID. Her name was still on it, her photo laminated behind a thin layer of plastic. Melissa had worn that badge for 10 years. Greg held it between two fingers, his gaze steady. "Hand over your credentials." Melissa hesitated. Her badge was clipped to the waistband of her uniform, the familiar weight of it pressing against her hip like it always had. A small, insignificant thing. And yet, it was the symbol of everything she had worked for. Her entire identity as a flight attendant. Her status. Her authority. She reached for it slowly, her fingers trembling. The clip resisted for just a second before sliding free. The moment it left her uniform, she felt naked, stripped of everything. She placed the badge in Greg's outstretched hand. He didn't hesitate. He set it down on the table like it was nothing, like she was nothing. Melissa's face burned with shame. Greg exhaled through his nose, moving to the next part of the process. "Your access to airline property has been revoked. You are not permitted to enter employee-only areas, including crew lounges and back offices." Melissa's jaw clenched. He wasn't just firing her, he was banning her from returning. Her hands shook as she tried to keep herself composed. Greg nodded toward another executive, a woman in a dark suit. She stepped forward holding a tablet. Per our policy, your dismissal is being logged in the airline employment database. She tapped a few things on the screen. Future employment references will reflect your termination for misconduct. Melissa felt her stomach drop. Her hands turned to ice. This wasn't just a firing. This was career destruction. Every major airline shared records. The moment she was logged as terminated for misconduct, she wouldn't be able to get another job, not with any airline. Melissa's breath came too fast. "Wait," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. Greg met her gaze, his expression hard. Melissa shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. "You don't have to put it like that," she rushed out. "You can just say I resigned. Just say it was a misunderstanding." Greg didn't flinch. "That's not how this works." Melissa's chest tightened. "Please," she breathed. "I'll never work here again. I'll never step foot on an airline-owned property again. Just don't put it in the record like that." Greg was silent for a long moment. Then he said the last thing she ever wanted to hear. "That decision has already been made." Melissa's world caved in. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching everything she had built, everything she had been, get swept away into the ocean below. She knew it then. This wasn't just one job. This was her entire career. Gone. Greg straightened, adjusting his cuffs. "You are now officially dismissed." The finality of it hit her like a brick. No warnings, no appeals, no coming back. She had never felt so small in her life. Greg nodded toward the security officer standing behind her. "Escort her out." Melissa's heart stopped. She turned sharply. "That's not necessary," she said quickly, her voice shaking. I can leave on my own." Greg's expression didn't change. "You can walk, or he can walk with you." Melissa's throat closed. She turned slowly, humiliation pressing down on her like a crushing weight. The officer stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, not forcefully, but present. Melissa clenched her teeth. She wanted to scream, to fight, to demand that this wasn't fair. But she knew it wouldn't matter. So she did the only thing she could. She turned, and she walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last. The terminal was too open, too full of people, all of them watching, knowing exactly what had just happened. By the time she reached the exit doors, her entire body was shaking. She wasn't a flight attendant anymore. She wasn't anything anymore. Melissa stepped through the automatic glass doors of the airport, the cold evening air hitting her face like a slap. The sudden change in temperature sent a shiver through her, but she barely felt it. Her body was numb. She kept walking, her shoes clicking against the pavement of the arrivals area, past the endless line of waiting taxis, past travelers pulling their suitcases behind them, past families hugging their loved ones after long flights. No one was waiting for her. No one knew or cared that she had just lost everything. She walked until she reached an empty bench near the pickup zone and sat down heavily, dropping her bag at her feet. Her hands were still trembling, her breathing uneven. It was over. Not just the job, not just this one flight, her entire career. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving on autopilot as she checked her messages again, still hoping anyone had replied. But her inbox was empty. Her so-called friends in the airline industry had already distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a flight attendant who had been fired by the owner of the airline. Her employee login was still locked. Her name was already wiped from the internal system. It was as if she had never worked there at all. A fresh wave of nausea hit her, and she pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. What was she supposed to do now? Her entire life had been built around her career. The early morning flights, the long layovers in different cities, the perfectly tailored uniform that made her feel like she was somebody. She had spent years walking through airport terminals with her head high, knowing that she belonged, that she had earned her place among the elite flight crews. And now, she wasn't even allowed in the crew lounge. She was nobody. Melissa's fingers curled into fists as anger fought its way past the humiliation. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had worked too hard for this. She wasn't a bad flight attendant. She knew the rules. She followed protocol. She had seniority. She had power. She had respect. But as soon as she had looked at Naomi Carter and assumed she wasn't worthy of first-class treatment, she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The irony of it all burned. She had spent years deciding who got to feel important, who got the extra attention, who got the warm greetings, the special treatment, the unspoken privileges that came with being somebody on her flights. And in the end, she was the one who wasn't important. A gust of wind blew through the terminal, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her uniform suddenly feeling like a costume. She looked down at her phone again, staring at the blank screen, at the reflection of her own face in the dim glow. For the first time, she realized something. This wasn't just about a cup of water. It had never been about water. It was about the way she saw people. She had looked at Naomi Carter and made an assumption. She had decided without thinking that this woman wasn't worthy of the same courtesy she gave others in first class. And she had done it without hesitation. She had assumed Naomi didn't belong, but she was the one who didn't belong. She felt her throat tighten, but she blinked hard, forcing back the lump rising in her chest. None of that mattered now. There were no do-overs, no second chances. Naomi Carter hadn't argued. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened her. She had simply let the world do what it always does. She had let consequences happen. Melissa sat there for a long time, the sounds of the airport fading into the background. She knew she had nowhere to go, no job to wake up for, no flights to prepare for, just a long, empty future. With a shaky breath, she reached for her bag, pulling it onto her lap. The fabric was worn at the edges from years of travel, the airline's logo stitched neatly onto the front. She traced the letters with her fingertips. And then, for the first time since the flight, she let herself cry. That's the end of the story. What do you think? Did she deserve what happened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.